So it all started when you were driving in your car to a poker tournament. That's where I do like some of my best thinking, is in the car, because everything else is so subconscious that your brain just has this free, relaxed reign to do whatever it wants. So what were you thinking about?
That's the same for me and when I drive as well. I was thinking about poker death.
Lovely.
Yes, it was something about tournaments, I think, because it was a freeze out, so there was no rebuys, which is a very stark reality. When you bust a tournament, you're just done. So the tournament's gone, it's over. You have to move on to the next thing. It's a lot more stark than, losing a buy-in in cash and obviously just buying in again. And I will say I don't normally play tournaments. I wouldn't consider myself to be a tournament player. I don't really spend much time at all studying tournaments or really learning about them, but I do think they're fun. And I decided to kind of take a shot at a tournament that was about an hour and a half away from me last weekend. And what I started to think about on the way there was this constant, I wouldn't say it's a fear, but it's a constant thought that I have about losing my bankroll, going broke. And it's not as if I'm coasting on fumes, or I don't feel like I'm underrolled necessarily. I think I have kind of a very normal bankroll for the stakes that I normally play. But nevertheless, it's in the back of my mind. And when I say I was thinking about death, it wasn't a physical death. It wasn't the death that we all experience at some point. But it was this idea of, what is poker death? And what does it mean to experience poker death? And more importantly, do I believe there is an afterlife once I experience poker death? And so I wanted to bring this topic to the podcast today to kind of get your feelings on this issue. And I think it's something that maybe a lot of players feel. I think maybe if you're someone that is a bit newer to the game like me, and who is really just playing seriously for the first time and tracking your results and kind of going through the ups and downs of the swings of being a cash game poker player, I think this is something that you've likely thought of too. So that's what I would like to, I thought would be good for us to explore today.
Yeah, just in case I was having a relaxed day where I just wanted to talk
Yeah.
strategy or something, I'm now faced with existential dread, and all kinds of demons have been brought back, as if last week and the dream about chaos and order wasn't enough. So thanks for that. Jokes aside,
I'm here.
yeah, that's why you're here. I know that whenever we have a chat, I'm going to be forced to contemplate existential matters. So at least that keeps me on my toes, keeps me on my philosophical toes. I do think that poker death is something that many people have experienced, and I think the best analogy for how a lot of poker students of mine historically have gone through a sort of poker death is more of a Buddhist reincarnation outlook than it would be like any kind of, I guess, infinite state that you go into in, like, I guess, in Christianity or Judaism or whatever. You go into more of a permanent and irrevocable afterlife that doesn't really get taken from you once you've been offered that. I wonder what happens if you misbehave in heaven. You can be cast out. I think that can happen, but other than that, you stay there. But I think with a lot of poker players, they die, as in they reach a point of poker ruin where the psychological feeling of failure, or the psychological trauma, or possibly the financial damage is so great, and the feeling of just like not having it in them to keep trying and suffer anymore is so great that they sever their ties from poker. So I'll tell you a case study first, and then I'll relate this back to you and your poker career. So I had a student who basically hired me for 10 lessons, having gone through Carrot Poker School, the theoretical school, obviously, that you've done yourself. You've done grade 1, you know what it is. He did a bunch of that. I think he did like grade 1 and grade 2. Then hired me for coaching, was really dedicated to make this his sole source of income going forward, to quit the job, and it started that process. And he was still in the early stages. He wasn't like a terribly new player, but he wasn't that experienced either, and definitely had a ton of leaks to fix and a ton of work to do to make this a long-term, full-time thing. And the pressure was getting so great that he'd put on himself to do this full-time, that when he started hitting downswings and probably wasn't quite winning in the game that he thought he was, maybe he'd gone through an upswing and that had given him a false sense of security, a false sense of immortality, as it were, that maybe doesn't exist in the real landscape. And he experienced the poker death, where he said, I'd like to request a refund from you, and I understand if it's not possible for coaching. I want to give up on poker. It's doing me too much psychological harm. I'm losing my mind. I've been on a huge downswing. I dread playing. I wake up in the morning and it feels like an impending doom, just the thought of being able to play poker. I paraphrase here entirely. And I really hope this player is not listening to this podcast. I really hope not. And the reason is not for why you guys would think or why you would think, Melissa. The reason I hope he's not listening is that I said, yeah, I don't normally do refunds for private coaching. It's in my T's and C's that packages aren't refundable. But I said, given your life circumstances and what's going on and getting to know you a bit, I'm happy to do that in this occasion. So I refunded him his money and I said, okay, can I just ask one thing though, like before we part ways? And he said, yeah, sure. I said, please don't come back to the game. I said, please don't come back to poker. The reason I said that is that I just felt that this player, that so many poker deaths are temporary and so many of them are these loops, these reincarnation loops where you don't actually work your way up necessarily. Sometimes, as in Buddhism, you lead a bad life, you work your way down the hierarchy. You come back as a dung beetle, then you come back as a maggot getting put on a fishing hook, and then you come back as some like horrible microbe of bacteria in a public urinal somewhere. You just really descend. Or you can become a lion and then you can become I don't know, are humans above lions? I'm not sure. But, in poker death, it's the same thing in this Buddhist interpretation of poker death, which I think is the most common type of poker death, in that you can actually end up making bad choices in your poker life that lead you to coming back an inferior poker player than you were before, with even worse mental game issues, and that tends to compound and snowball. So I said to this player, please don't come back to the game, and he said, do you know what, that's like one of the most honest pieces of advice I've ever had. I was not expecting you to say that, and people generally aren't. But I really hope that for people who I think are very likely to go on a regress where they come back as a worse and worse form of life or poker player in this analogy, that they really do stay away for good and that their death is permanent. Because after all, death is, I'd rather there was nothing when I died than some kind of eternal hell. Existence just for existence's sake is not always a good thing. So that's how I think poker death relates to poker in the most practical, common sense from the people that I teach. But I think there are loads of other forms of poker death, and I'm interested to hear what other forms of poker death you were maybe considering and what they may even mean for you.
I think that's really interesting, that idea of returning a worse player than you were had you not died. So being reincarnated as a maggot on a fish line or whatever, fish hook or whatever, however you put it. I think I take a more, I guess you could call it like, I think about, well, I was raised, I'm not a religious person now, but I was raised Catholic. And so I think I have in me a Christian outlook on life and afterlife. And I think that what I'm interested in, or one of the things I'm interested in with regards to poker death, is what does it do while we're still living? So this idea of an extreme example would be someone who is such in real life outside of poker, is such a hypochondriac. They're so afraid of catching a disease. They're so afraid of dying. They're so afraid of suffering that, they're unable to leave their house. Or if they do, they leave their house only for a very short time. I think this is something that was magnified, obviously, during COVID. I think that situation brought out a lot of these tendencies in society, and a lot of them are still here. But putting that aside, I think this idea of how does this fear of death inform how we play while we're still alive? So you could be someone who is totally healthy, totally fine, but not willing to take any chances in life because you're afraid of what might happen. I think with poker, there is a sense of having to both embrace the idea of death, but also not be reckless about it. So there's a fine balance between acknowledging, like, I could go broke, I could lose all my money, I could lose all my resources, I could get to the point where I have nothing left to play with and I have to then move on to something else. That could happen. And I'm okay with that. And I think that acceptance it's easy to say that. And I can certainly say for myself, like, I've accepted the idea that I may experience a poker death at some point, but that doesn't mean that it's easy for me, or it doesn't mean that it's not something that I think about in game during a session that may affect my play. And so as much as I think we all think about poker death when we're maybe on a downswing or losing a lot of money, what's really interesting to me is when you think about it at other times. So I've had times when I think at the end of last year, I had a number of sessions where things just went really well. and I was definitely on an upswing. And I remember in the back of my mind the whole time thinking, when is this going to end? When is the other shoe going to drop? When are things going to even out in a way that seems fair? Because right now this doesn't seem fair. And so I wanted to kind of bring that up as well, because I think that's much more of a, not a daily occurrence for me, but it's something that's much more prevalent when I play than I think I would like it to be.
So generally the brain, at least my brain, makes things pertinent and relevant when there are unresolved matters. So like if there's something like I know I need to, could be something as simple as I need to phone my mother and I've not done it yet, I might experience a slight bit of dread about phoning my mother, which is fair enough, for me and my relationship with my mother. Just kidding. But it could be the case that something as harmless as that, just needing to contact a family member, could actually trigger anxiety, or something like I need to put the dishwasher on could trigger anxiety solely because it's unresolved, and it's just your brain's way of sort of saying to you, by the way, I'm going to give you just enough anxiety to make you continuously aware of this thing that you actually do it. And maybe a lot of your issues with poker death, you sort of say it's coming up more and more frequently than I would like during a session, even when things are going well. Why am I thinking about this when things are going well? Why is this in my head in this random hand that's not even necessarily going that badly for me? It could just be that this is an existential poker question that you've not solved yet. And I think there's something to exposure here as well. Like when I have a student that, let's say, packs what they were afraid of, as we talked about in our first episode. Check out our episodes 1 and 2 of this podcast, by the way, guys, if you haven't already. And do drop us a little review on Spotify. We really appreciate it. While you're at it, it'll help us grow. But if you cast your mind back to that, we talked about packing what you're afraid of. And a lot of students will pack a thought, like you alluded to in episode 1, such as, I don't want to get raised here. I don't want to get outdrawn here. Something like this. But really, the way to get to the bottom of that isn't to say, don't worry, it's not a big deal if you get outdrawn. And it's not to say you shouldn't be wary of that. And it's not even to say, don't worry, that won't happen often. If you're afraid of dying and I'm like, don't worry, it's not that likely that you'll die, that's not very reassuring. So really what I do with those students when I coach them mental game wise is I say, okay, so what is it you're afraid of? What's this resistance in your game protecting you from? What's this misfire, as I'd say in my book, Poker Therapy, trying to protect you from? And they'll typically say, well, the reason I didn't want to get raised is that I would feel a sense of loss or a sense of like having to fold loads of equity if I am raised here. And then I'll say, okay, well, in order to actually assess this objectively and figure out whether that is a bad enough thing for you to like not bet the turn, we need to actually get into how often it will happen and things like that. But in order to do that objectively and fairly, we need to actually make sure you're no longer terrified. Because while you're terrified, you can't analyze in an unbiased way. It's basically impossible. So we'll say, what's the worst case scenario for this particular resistance or fear? What is the thing that you're the most afraid of? And I originally heard about this from Elliot Rowe, sort of poker and sports psychologist. And they'll say something like, well, I'm worried that when I get jammed on and lose, it actually means that I'm a bad poker player. It actually means that I've made a huge mistake and I'm no good. So oftentimes by asking, what is it that's making you think about this so much? What is it that's making you like form this resistance, this mental program that's undesirable? We trigger the student to actually get in touch with like a really deep existential poker fear. Like, I think I'm going to experience poker death. It could even go that far. So I wonder if I could throw this back to you and say, is this because it's unresolved? Like you haven't fully decided what would happen after your poker death? And is there like a kind of a way that you could plan for this worst case scenario? What if you did go broke poker wise? What if you couldn't play poker anymore? What if you had to give up the journey, let go of the chase of becoming whatever you want to become in poker? What would that mean? And if you can formulate a plan, the next part of this is the optimal response. The student has to formulate the optimal response to the worst case scenario happening. Again, this comes from Elliot Rowe. It's not my own original idea. And then the student goes off and says, well, if I did experience poker death, or I did experience like a realization that I sucked, I would just have to go and study and it would be great in the latter case. Or in the former, oh, I'm really into chess actually. I've always wanted to take up chess and my job pays really well and I still have my family. So things would actually be really good or something like that. So is poker death like having to give up? Do you fear that, do you think? Like, do you like want to avoid it because you fear it? And if you do fear it, how could you formulate like a plan around that that maybe makes you, I don't know, happier to bear that fate? I've totally turned this like as if you're like my patient right now, but I don't know why I've done that. But yeah, I'm interested to hear more.
No, that's okay. That's okay. It's helpful. I will say I have formulated a plan and I have kind of sketched out in my mind. I haven't written it down. Maybe that would be helpful. It actually never occurred to me to write it down, but I have sketched out in my mind what would happen if I went broke, what would happen if I reached that poker death, and what my afterlife, quote unquote, would be like. So I would say when it comes to the idea of poker death, that I am definitely a believer. I'm a believer in an afterlife. I'm not a poker atheist in the sense that there's no life after death and that you lose consciousness and everything's over and the world goes and the world moves on without you. I think that part of you lives on after your poker death, and I think that in some ways it's up to me to determine whether that part of me will be a positive thing or a negative thing. And so I'm going to make a metaphor here back to religion, but I think that one of the things that what Christians believe is this idea that, well, if I behave a certain way in life, then I'll be rewarded in an afterlife. So, one of the criticisms that people often make to atheists, like, I don't know if you've ever watched these YouTube videos of Richard Dawkins or, folks like that, Sam Harris, kind of debating religious figures on the topic of atheism. But one of the criticisms of atheism is that if there's no God, then where do morals come from? Why are we good if there's no God? And this is, I think, it's a really interesting question. And I think there's various answers to that question. And I think it's just very interesting. But bringing it back to poker, if you are a poker atheist and you say, I have no idea what happens after I go broke, I fear my death, but I also believe that there's no afterlife, or whatever that afterlife is, I don't understand. I can't possibly begin to understand it. It's not meant for me to understand. So therefore I'm going to live in the moment. Well, I think it makes it very hard for you to, much in the way that I think certain religious people will criticize atheism. It makes it very hard to live in the present if you don't have a sense of moral duty to a higher power. I'm saying this as a kind of general matter, and I'm sure there's people on maybe listening who know a lot more about religion than me, and I certainly do not mean to offend anyone with what I'm saying, but this is, I think, one way to I think about poker, in the sense that my belief in a poker afterlife informs how I play now. And that is, like you said, I fear my poker death, but I think I also try to embrace it to the extent I can. I'm never totally without it, so I don't think that I'm not the type of player who says, I can lose X amount of buy-ins and walk away from a session and be totally fine. I think that there's always a sense of, okay, well, this was a terrible session and tomorrow's a new day. But what happens if tomorrow's session is worse? And what happens if the session after that is even worse? And what happens if I get into a situation where I can't win? What's even worse? What if it's completely outside of my control? What if I'm playing absolutely optimally and I'm just getting very unlucky? Cards aren't going my way. What happens then? These aren't necessarily, I think, always rational thoughts, but there's something that that come across my mind sometimes. And one way that I counter that is, you talk about making a plan for an afterlife. I have a plan, but I also believe in an afterlife. So I believe that if I were to go broke, then I would have a kind of rebirth. I would have a kind of, things wouldn't be perfect, but I think in some ways I would have burned off something. I think this idea that, like, growth is pain and learning and knowledge is painful. And I think there's a reason sometimes why we go through these things, whether that reason is outside of your control or within your control. I think that there's a point to it. Otherwise, I think I would have a very difficult time playing.
Yeah, I think there has to be something outside of the game that we're playing for as well. Like, we can play for the love of the game, but I've experienced this myself when I get really into a computer game or something like that, or get really into like some hobby, and I'm like, I love it when I'm doing it. I'm totally enveloped. I'm enthralled. But if you made me do that 100% of the time and it became my career or my life, it would be like, well, what is actually the purpose of this? Like, what is this doing to the world? How is it affecting change, like, out with me and my silly journey through, these graphics that are popping up on my screen or whatever? And I think it's really like that for poker players too. And I think there's a few ways different poker players handle this whole existential problem of, like, poker death and what happens next. And I think atheism is one of them. Poker atheism, that is. The idea that poker is everything to me, and if I fail as a poker player, I have nothing left, and I won't even think about what could be the case. And actually, this is extremely nihilistic. It's much, much more nihilistic than being an atheist about the existence of a deity in life. And the reason for that is that there are clearly, without a doubt, other things that still exist, and there is clearly, empirically and verifiably, a sense in which you still exist as a human after poker. So to say that poker is everything and there can be nothing else is not only skeptical, it's not only like sort of Descartes with the demon and all of this stuff, like doubting the senses, it's worse than that. It's doubting everything. It's doubting the existence. It's worse than Descartes' position of the only thing I can believe in is the existence of my own mind. It's even worse than that. Because it's like saying, despite the fact that there is clear evidence that things exist after poker, I'm going to like suppress it all and not think about any of it and place all of my eggs in this basket that I'll be immortal and live forever. So those people who are poker atheists, I think they struggle immensely with the thought of ruin. And, you know, like you said, what if you just had one bad session after another? If you go to primedope.com variance calculator, poker variance calculator, guys, you can actually plug in a bunch of different win rates and you can see sample lines being generated. I don't know if we did this, Melissa, with your game, if we ever went to the site.
No.
So it's something that we can do at some point, but definitely it's cool because it shows you 20 random lines, like 20 random people with your suspected objective win rate. It plugs in the standard deviation for the game, which is like the measure of variance, and it just shows you like 20 random outcomes, and every once in a while, one of them will be awful. You just be like, oh my god, it sucks for that person. That person has really suffered here. They're like 80 buy-ins below expectation. Like all the other lines are in a bunch and they're just like, woof. It's like that one person that just had the roughest childhood ever and is like effectively doomed unless they're in like the 0.01% that can recover from that amount of adverse childhood experiences. It's a bit like that. That's the equivalent of it. So that could happen to you. That could be you. And you're having all these real thoughts. So you do need a way to bounce back from that. You need a way to be able to say, right, I need to accept that this can happen to me, and I need to have some kind of religious system in place. And this is what a lot of people do in real life as well. One of the benefits to the human civilization, human race, of having religion and a belief in an afterlife is it does actually make you able to focus on the present because you've solved a problem that is a legitimate threat. Death is a really, really big problem. And to be able to say, I have a faith that, or belief that X will happen to me after I die. I'm not saying that's the only reason to believe in an afterlife, although I'm not sure I do empirically in real life. I'm more towards the atheist end of the spectrum as well. But there's a real benefit to that, regardless of what other reasons may cause you to do that. So what other kind of beliefs could we have in poker? Let's go back to the sort of Catholic poker afterlife idea that if you conduct yourself in a bad way while you're in poker, it's okay. You can repent, you can confess to your coach. I'm basically the priest in the booth here and you're the confessor. And I'm sitting there like, child, tell me. And this is great. I'm loving this role and I wish I'd dressed the part. For the people watching on YouTube, you can watch this on YouTube, but don't be weird. Just listen on Spotify. The Carrot Poker School is a 33-hour academic course on poker theory. It's not a course about GTO and it's not a course about exploitative play. Poker theory is much more important than both of these things initially, and it is the bedrock on which your game will eventually rest. But what does it mean to talk about poker theory, and what is the key distinction between these three things? GTO is the answer at the back of the textbook. You can look it up, but that doesn't mean that you know how to solve the equation. Playing a GTO strategy is basically impossible for a human, but if you could do it, what it would mean is that you couldn't be exploited by anyone. What it wouldn't mean is that you were playing in the best way possible. In fact, far from it. Your real life opponents have so many defects in their strategy, so many beautiful imbalances that you can exploit, that actually copying a GTO strategy, even if it was possible, would be a very bad idea. So to me, a course on GTO would simply be an endless list of solver outputs and frequencies and EVs. It would be a bunch of data that was totally unusable and you wouldn't even want to use it even if you could. Poker theory is the realm of rationality, logic, the tying together of poker ideas to formulate the right conclusions. It's basically how to think. Poker theory does concern an objective realm, but the objective realm is concepts. Grade 1 of the Carrot Poker School launches into an explanation of how equity, fold equity, EV, value betting, bluffing, range advantage, nut advantage, countless more concepts. Grade 2 takes it further. Grade 3 is more advanced still. The Carrot Poker School takes you through all of the axioms and logical concepts needed to formulate a sound strategy, but also to have an understanding of the game that helps you use exploitative play. Exploitative play is any deviation from the GTO output we talked about before. Anytime a human plays poker, they play exploitatively. But what we really mean when we talk about a course on exploits, like Cash Injection, the 10-hour exploit course on Carrot Corner, is intentional exploits. How are you going wrong? What can I do about it? How do I maximize my EV to take advantage of your deviations from what would be a theoretically sound strategy? The Carrot Poker School is the start of your voyage through poker theory. It's going to form the bedrock of your game, and I truly believe it's the right starting point for any serious poker player of any format. You can check out at carrotcorner.com. Now let's get back to the content. So that's kind of what you're doing, right? You can sort of repent and confess all the way through. You go to your coach, you say, Coach, I fucked up this hand. Look, I raised the flop again. I'm like, Melissa, I told you to stop raising all the damn flops all the time. Like, this can definitely happen. Then you go away and you say your Hail Marys, which are effectively like your, I will not reopen the action when the SPR is low and villain is shoving a lot, and I'm going to experience a big drop in equity if I have to fold. Random technical thoughts, guys. Sorry, had to throw it in. That's what's going on there. So that's like the kind of Catholic thing. But then the other side of it is, if you live your poker life badly, you've not touched on this yet, right? You said if you live your poker life well, there will be things you redeem in the next life after you finish off with poker and move on to other things. But also, and with the Catholic approach, there will be immense suffering if you conduct your poker life badly. So how closely do we want to accept this metaphor, this analogy? And what do you think about, firstly, how to conduct your poker life in a good way so that you do reach poker heaven afterwards and benefit? And what might that look like outside of poker? What is the heaven you reach when you experience poker death, having lived your poker life well? And what is the hell that someone could experience after poker life by living their poker life badly?
Very good question. Well, I think that one of the things you can do to get to the poker afterlife is, I think, be honest with yourself about how you're playing, what's happening, the decisions you made. And when you talk about this idea of like repenting, after a session, I think that's really important. One of the things that if you talk to people who are, very religious, especially Catholics, they will say like the more kind of serious you become about it, the more you realize like how many sins you have, right? So it's like this idea of like, you realize how many bugs are on the windshield. Before you were just driving and it was fine, but this idea that like the closer you get to God, the further away you get. And it's because you acknowledge your own failings, you're more aware of your own failings. And I think that there's a lot to be said about that. And I think that can have intense, extreme mental anguish on someone if it goes too far. But I think in terms of poker, acknowledging this is what you've done wrong and that there is a way to do things better, acknowledging that you have behaved in a way that is not optimal, and not hiding those things from yourself. And if you work with a coach, I think not hiding them from your coach. I think one of the things that I always struggle with when it comes to, our coaching sessions is, what hands do I bring to you? So do I bring to you the hand that I thought was just like totally awful and a disaster and a total blunder? Or do I bring a hand that I feel is more perhaps representative of how I play? There's pros and cons to both of that. But I think that you have to be able to say, I made this total blunder. And even if I think this is not who I am, this is not me functioning normally as a poker player, it does exist. It did happen. It is something I did. So I think one of the things you can do to get to this poker afterlife and have a positive poker afterlife is to be honest with yourself and with whoever you're talking to about poker, whether that be a coach or a group of players that you're studying with.
I thought of something really weird there, which is that in life, if you imagine like the good Catholic that goes to the booth, I don't know how often Catholics are meant to go and confess, like weekly, let's say they go every Sunday or something, seems about right. They go in there, the priest is like, child, speak to me, what have you done? A lot of the time they're going to be like, I upset my mother, I stole something from a shop, I got angry and smashed a bowl that my spouse really likes. Things like this, right? These are sort of minor. I'm sure there are much worse things that people confess as well. But most of them will be harm inflicted on others. I don't recall, from my very limited exposure to Catholicism through TV and film, which is about the only place, or books, the only place I would, like fiction in general, is the only place I've really encountered Catholicism, because I've mostly avoided churches my whole life. I'm not a religious person, but it's mostly stuff that they've done that could harm others. It's very rare that you see them come in and say, I slept in again, I didn't organize my bedroom and it led to me missing an important call which hurt me. There's very little like, I've harmed myself here through my own actions, even though most of the bad choices humans make, I would argue, are more likely to cause inward harm than outward harm, based on our tribal, connectedness and how little we want to harm the tribe. In poker, there is no teammate. There is nobody else you can harm apart from yourself. And I think that makes it so incredibly easy, not only to sin very, very often. If you are the only possible, logically permissible target of your sin, no one else, I think you're likely to sin far more often.
Hmm.
And my question back to you would be, does that make it harder to be a good poker Catholic?
Yeah, I think so. I definitely think that's true. This idea that, so I guess there is a way that you could hurt other people, I think, at the poker table other than yourself. I mean, I think the way you treat people for sure
Sure.
is something that I think sometimes we struggle with. I struggle with it all the time. Like the idea of like not I've learned to kind of bite my tongue in terms of like things that I see other players do at a poker table and all the silly things and frustrating points you encounter in a session, in a live session. But I think to your point of how do we deal with this idea that like we're hurting ourselves, I think that's an important point that you have to deal with as part of an entire approach to poker. So it's not just like I'm being hard on myself, but it's I've had a bad session and I'm treating the people in my life terribly because of it.
Yep.
So like I've certainly had situations where I've come home and I've not wanted to necessarily I haven't been in a good mood and I haven't necessarily been nice to the people around me. And so I've been very short-tempered, the people that I care about in my life. And so I think that's maybe one way, if that gets to kind of answer your question.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, it's a good
Yeah.
example. Everyone on YouTube is just watching the cat walk in front, put his bum in front of the webcam here. No one's really watching on YouTube, so Spotifyers, that's what just happened, which is why
Yeah.
Melissa started cracking up a little bit in the middle of that point, in the middle of talking about hurting her loved ones.
I tried to look away because I started to laugh.
Just in case they wondered why you found it amusing that a bad session caused you to hurt your loved ones, just clarify that's what happened. But yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I've been there. I've been in relationships in the past where I remember playing, if I go down memory lane a little bit here, I lived in this flat and I played poker in the kitchen on the laptop, and my girlfriend at the time would walk into the room. I was about 21, 22. And if I was having a good session, I remember I would always be like quite talkative and I'd be like, oh yeah, what's for dinner, blah, blah, blah. And I'd be really happy. And then if I was having a bad session, I would be prone to just being like, can you stop making sound? She's like gone to the fridge and she's like getting some milk out the fridge. And I'm like, why are you doing that when I'm trying to play poker? Like really kind of horrible tunnel vision where like you're feeling so vulnerable in that moment that like you can only lash out at things around you and you can only like feel your own vulnerability. You can't really see anything else. And I think there's a lot of poker players that do that. That we talked last time about the burn this place to the ground quote by Helmuth. I think that quote is so absolutely brilliant. Not in the sense that I think he's an insightful genius for threatening to burn a casino to the ground, but I think it basically conveys the utmost threatened, aggressive child that's chosen fight over flight in that moment that you could possibly convey. This casino has dealt me bad cards that's caused me to lose lots of my money, so I will burn it to the ground. I will commit arson. I will set the casino on fire and kill all the people that are within it. This is like the utmost like tyrannical expression of barbarism possible. And I think you're right that poker, if it goes badly, it absolutely can cause you to sin against other people as well. I think from my point of view, I'm dealing with the kind of more introverted, at least while doing poker stuff, sort of player who's working really hard, is like using Poker Tracker, reviewing hands, playing a session, using Poker Tracker, reviewing hands, playing a session, the sort of isolated chaos cycle that we talked about in episode 2 of this podcast. And for that person, I think all of the sin that happens is against themselves mostly, or maybe like a loved one when they come home or family member or something. But man, I just think that the harm you can do to yourself usually in magnitude, maybe not in terms of morality, but in terms of magnitude, very often outweighs the harm we do to others. And this is, again, we always reference Jordan Peterson in this podcast. And to do that one more time, he talks about treat yourself as someone who's worthy of being looked after, right? Who you should look after. And there's all these stories about people not taking their meds and dying, but giving a dog meds for 3 years that it needs, religiously every morning without fail. And I do think that it's so much easier to sin against oneself than it is to sin against others. And I think that poker creates an environment where, therefore, there's loads of sin. So how about the proposition that the average poker player sins way more in poker than the average person does in life because of this whole, you're usually the target of your sin, though your point is really valid that you can also sin against others because of poker, but maybe not within poker.
Yes, no, I think that's 100% true. And I think, you know, like you said, we talked about this in our earlier episodes, but I think it's such an important point. And I think we're all prone to this as poker players because it's easier to be harder on yourself than it is to really be aggressive or angry toward other people. And I think that most poker players naturally are not, you know, you have to kind of get along with people. You have to be invited back to the game. If you're playing a lot, then your reputation is really important. A big part of winning is getting into the right games and playing with the right people and getting the right opportunities. And just like any other career you have, networking and your professional reputation is really important. And I think that it's easier to just kind of walk away from a session that where something horrible happened, and instead of getting in your car and, you know, saying, "Oh God, that person played so terribly. I can't believe they made that call," or "I can't believe they showed up on the river with those cards." You say, "I'm so stupid for allowing myself to get into that situation. I knew this person was a fish. I knew this person was inexperienced. Of course they would show up on the river with those two cards. Of course this would have happened. How could I have not seen this happen? How could I have been so dumb?" And it's just so easy to do that, and that's such a trap. And it also, I think, it satisfies this internal need that we all have naturally for a kind of justice in the world. And I think most of us are not okay with, you know, human tragedy. We're not okay with hearing news about all of these. This is another religious concept, but when bad things happen to good people, like we're not okay with that. And the reason we're not okay with that is because we have an internal sense of right and wrong. We have an internal moral structure that, you know, is very strong within us. And poker threatens that moral structure constantly because it's constantly throwing bad things at good people. You're constantly in situations where maybe it's not you, but you're seeing it happen to another player where they're getting in better against their opponent and still losing. This happened to me recently in a session this last weekend. So that same day I played in the tournament, just, I know everyone's on the edge of their seats, but I did not win the tournament. And I busted, like in the third or fourth round. I was rivered and I busted someone rivered two pair against me. And that was pretty awful. And I had actually forgotten how tilting it can be to lose a tournament and have to walk away because I don't play tournaments a lot, but maybe this is a topic for another show, but it's a totally different type of tilt than losing in a cash game.
It's a mini death of sorts, isn't it?
It is. It is. Well, and that's what got me thinking about this topic. And then I had my long drive home to finish my thinking about death. But then I went and I played a cash game session, which may not have been the smartest move because I think I still was a little traumatized from my tournament bust out. But in that session, I got like rivered, like I think I counted like 9 times. And it was just uncanny. It was spooky. It was weird. It was like, what is going on here? And I knew that I should have left the session because it was going so bad, but I almost kept playing just to see if it would keep happening. It was like, you know, those horror movies where you're like watching someone like walk into the dark house and you're like, why are you doing that? Like the serial killer is in the house. Like, why are you doing that? Just run away. This was me in that session. It was like, I kept going into that session, like kept playing because I was just like, I need to see the depths of this. Like what is actually happening here? And eventually I did leave. And I think it was difficult, but that I kind of forgot where I was going on this because I'm thinking back to that session. But
no, I love it. I think this is the best way that this podcast can go. It's just a completely free discussion of ideas. A few more points then, just to move on to here that I want to explore, just because we have about 20 minutes left. One of them is I want to explore the idea of nihilism in poker a bit more because, like, okay, so a nihilistic person in life would be someone who basically devalues everything, thinks there's no moral worth, thinks there's absolutely no moral objectivity. Nihilism is related to atheism. There are arguments that one implies the other and things like that, but we'll leave those aside for now. But nihilism in poker would be this idea that I think many people adopt. So nihilism, let's just be clear, is a way of coping with reality. It's a very bad way, in my opinion, of coping with reality to say that nothing has any worth, but the retreat into sort of primitive barbaric human state of nature, mental states, or non-thinking, the retreat into sort of like not using the more evolved parts of the brain and just pillaging and taking and burning and being a complete brute. And the modern day equivalent of that would maybe like you're using heroin, you become a drug addict and you roam the streets and you're mugging people and robbing from people and stuff like that. Maybe you're a murderer. These are all sort of if you can murder someone, not in every case, but a lot of murderers probably have a very nihilistic outlook on life, that nothing matters, they've suffered so much that there can't be any value in anything. Otherwise, they wouldn't have experienced this much suffering, and therefore, it's actually not that bad for them to take the life of another, because they don't matter either. That other person also doesn't matter, right? That's the extreme of nihilism. You can do whatever you want because nothing has ever mattered and never will. And I think there are poker players, Melissa, who are absolute nihilists. I think that some of the people who get into poker are chaotic and nihilistic. And I think that when they're in poker, they will very happily just gamble it up and degen it up to such an extent that the main thing they're actually driving at is some form of destruction. And it might be the destruction of the self, or it might be the destruction of others. But sometimes I watch these stream games, and you know my thoughts on stream games. I think they should be mostly modified so that there are more pros, and poker's turned into more of a sport, and they have commentators actually have a clue what's going on them and things like that. But to get back to the point of this, I feel like the outlook that there is no afterlife can even be extended to within poker. I know we're talking about poker death, but I think the poker nihilist who just wants to gamble it up and self-destruct and make all these bad decisions has actually decided that death is already life, that there is already just death, and that's what they're living in. They're living in death. There is no life. There's nothing worth living for in poker, so why don't I just move up 4 times in stakes and play for 20 hours straight? There are people I've taught that chase losses for 9 hours. They're basically disrespecting themselves. They're not even eating or drinking. They're just saying there's no value in anything, so let me just play this game for another 9 hours until I've self-destructed and died. And that to me is nihilistic. So what do you think about poker nihilism, and what are the best, I guess, religions, poker religions, or afterlife sort of beliefs that could help us avoid it? I think we both agree we need to avoid that at all costs, and that those role models, anti-role models that do that are bad. But what about, how do we get to the point? How do we avoid getting to the point where we want to burn down a casino? We want to literally commit arson and kill people because the casino is poker is so worthless, and life within poker is so worthless that we should just torch people, and torch a casino. How do we I know I'm mocking Phil Hellmuth here, but I'm also making a serious point. How do we avoid that? Is it through, we've talked about Catholicism, the sort of atone for your sins, confess your poker sins, seek the afterlife, avoid the hell. We've talked about the guilt that may come along with that, how it could go too far. We've talked about Buddhism, the idea that poker players are maybe involuntarily trapped in a cycle of dying over and over again and coming back as worse poker versions of themselves, sometimes better ones, but usually worse in my experience. The ones who would have come back as better ones tend not to die. That's just my experience in coaching. What other religions are there out there, and what other ways could there be of avoiding this atheism / actual nihilism within poker?
Well, I think the thing about poker nihilism is I actually think it's really boring. I really do. And I think that maybe one way of looking at it is that a belief in something is an adventure. It's something that is challenging. It's something that is not easy. It's something that requires work. It requires focus. It requires discipline. It requires a direction. So if someone came up to me and said, there's no point in living, I'm going to just do whatever I want and be nihilistic, I probably wouldn't have, I don't think there's an argument to necessarily prove them wrong. I think that if you could tell them, here's all the things you should value. Here's all the reasons that I believe life is worth living. Here's all the reasons why I think it's worthwhile to treat people with dignity and respect. But ultimately, I don't know if you can prove that by any kind of infallible logic. This is something that I think it's the theme of major philosophy. I think the novel Crime and Punishment, Dostoevsky's novel, is about this. The main character is a young man who's destitute, and he's a student. He has no money, and he's a nihilist, and he decides he's going to kill his landlord, and he just murders her. And then the book is about him dealing with that after he has murdered her. And the way that book describes the experience of someone who has crossed that line, who has truly embraced nihilism and nothingness, and how that feels to them in this life while they're still living. This is not someone, the brilliance of that book is that it's not someone that's a psychopath. It's not, a Jeffrey Dahmer type character. It's not someone that is so mentally ill that they don't have a concept of right and wrong, that they are he's not a quote unquote sick person.
He's reached a philosophical conclusion that actually ethically this might just be as good as any other course of action.
As good as any other course of action, exactly. So I guess my way of thinking about this when it comes to poker is So a quick story, on Sunday morning, I played a session and I went to my normal card room, and there was a game there that had been running all night. And this was like 11 o'clock in the morning on a Sunday. They had been playing since the night before, and it was like 4 people. And all they were doing they were playing bomb pots with lockouts. It wasn't even hold'em. It was just bomb pot after bomb pot after bomb pot after bomb pot. And like one player had like 6K in front of him, and another person had like, one. It was just like, it was ridiculous. And I don't know those players, and I don't know much about what was happening in the session, but there definitely seemed to be a little bit of nihilism going on based on what I witnessed. And I see other players that I play with who come in and raise any 2 cards and, get it in with nothing because what's the point, kind of thing. And I find that really boring. I find that approach to poker really uninteresting. Like, if you're going to gamble, like, there's other ways to gamble that I think maybe are easier and possibly more fun in a casino.
Absolutely. I absolutely agree. It's like taking heroin and like distilling it. Poker distilled. Here we go. We're distilling it down and making it into some kind of like Coca-Cola derivative heroin and drinking it and doing all of that in your own lab instead of just like shooting up. It's kind of not that we recommend injecting heroin either on this podcast. Let's just be clear. But it's a bit like that. It's like, if you want to destroy yourself, I would rather watch people play craps and destroy themselves than watch people get it all in a bomb pot with bottom pair or get 8-4 off all in pre. Like, see these stream games, Melissa? I actually have no tolerance for what they become, because you just have high stake nihilistic degeneracy and there's nothing entertaining about it. Not only that, but it's a stain upon the poker society insofar as new people that turn up and you say, oh, what's this massive trending YouTube video with like millions of views that's being recommended? Oh, it's a guy getting it all in with a random hand and then like threatening to burn down a casino. I'll shut up about this now. There's lots of other things people say when they lose, but people getting angry, people like gambling it up, destroying, people enjoying like getting in random hands pre and flipping coins in the air and stuff like this. And it's like, okay, a little bit of that can be really fun, like injecting a bit of that into a session where it's still poker. But why are we turning poker? Why are we using the game of poker for this purpose? Is it like, it's really strange, isn't it? And I agree with you. That's a really degenerate, nihilistic situation you walked into that Sunday morning, especially because, kind of ironically, it's Sunday morning, it's confession time in church, it's the holy time, and you've got up like a normal person in the morning, probably had breakfast and driven to a casino, and you're ready to like play a civilized session, and you walk into that. So what did you do? Did you join it, or did you just say, I'm not going near that?
No, I didn't, because sometimes I also like, I felt like I don't want to lose my money to these people. Like, I don't want to really, it's not fun for me to play a game where like people are just getting it in and gambling at that level. Like, that's just not fun for me. One of the things that I struggle with is like, do I have enough gamble in me? Am I too risk adverse, for poker? And I think that's a different topic, but I think it is interesting because you can go the other way too and be too risk adverse and not have enough nihilism or not have enough risk in your life. But my point ultimately is that I think that's boring. And I think that what's fun for me, and I think for a lot of players and maybe a lot of people that are listening to this podcast or watching this video, if you've made it this far, I think that you're someone that you're not okay with being kind of a quote unquote normie. And I use that term because I like it a lot. And I think that it helps explain like it's really normal to be someone that goes in like degens in poker. Like, that's really normal. Like, you might as well just be someone that like, watches like, middlebrow entertainment and like has really no interesting opinions. And this is going to sound a little mean, but that's kind of in my experience, the people that are interesting to talk to you about poker, the people that are interesting to kind of learn from and be around, or the people that are kind of challenging themselves, who see the beauty of the game, who see the challenge of the game, who see the potential for the game, who have dedicated their lives or a significant part of their lives to this game of logic and thinking. Like, that's a really interesting pursuit to me, not the person who drives the car 100 miles an hour down the freeway and runs a red light just to see what will happen.
Well, they're probably going to the casino to play bomb pots, and they have like a KFC drumstick in their hand as they do. The steering wheel's all greasy.
It's all greasy, yes.
Yeah. This reminds me of a kind of platonic sort of view on poker where you know in like Plato's Republic you had like the philosopher kings who were like the only real ones who should be they're like a council of decision makers, and there's a lot of good you can say about a system where you actually have uncorruptible philosopher kings, and it's probably not possible for humans, but if you imagine this like panel of uncorruptible philosophers who are like really good at thinking and reasoning, and also know back then, remember, like everything was part of philosophy. So like finance was probably part of philosophy, physics and chemistry were part of philosophy, everything. Philosophy was just, well, it means knowledge, right? That's really all it was. It was like, do you know about stuff? So you had the more knowledgeable, capable people making all of the decisions. And I think what you're kind of saying, Melissa, is that in poker you have in some sense a hierarchy where, as far as the technical aspects of the game are concerned, you have people who are interested in that and aren't nihilistic and embrace a goal and have a direction and set their eyes on that and try to obtain it. And those are the people who will want to talk about, how should this player have played here? Like, what's the cool aspects of this hand? Like, what can we learn from this? What can we enjoy in this that's of an intellectual higher order pleasure, going back to like Plato, a higher order pleasure as opposed to a lower order pleasure. And this is one of the things that we really notice in poker, because if I go to, let's say, the Hippodrome Casino in London, I go there with like people from Carrot Corner, from the Discord group that I know, like my friends, let's say, and we sit at a table and there are 4 of us and there are 5 other people. Well, maybe 2 of those people are kind of like interested in learning, and it's not about what you know. I'm not trying to be an intellectual snob here and be like, if you know nothing about poker, you're worthless. Not at all. It's about your attitude towards learning. And there's a real depressive nihilism about the guy, and I'm sorry if this is you listening to this. It's probably not, you wouldn't be listening to this, but the guy that's just sat there. There's always sports on the TV. Always. I don't know about where you play, but there's always like a football match on, soccer match.
Yeah.
We would say for you, it's probably basketball or baseball or American football is on the television, and they're sat with their apps and they're gambling, they're sports betting, and they'll look down at a hand, disgustedly throw away a hand because it's not a good hand, and at the same time gripe about how they were getting 4-1 on X bet that didn't come in, and they'll turn to him and be like, oh, you got Crystal Palace. That's a football team in England, right? You got Crystal Palace, mate. And I'll be like, what? And they'll be like, you got Palace. Like, are you asking me if I have backed this random team that happens to be on the television right now to beat this other team? And like, I like football. I watch the World Cup, and I support a team. I will watch a game of football if that's what I'm doing. But when I'm at the casino, I'm there socially, or I'm there to play poker and enjoy that. And the last thing I want to do is watch some random game that I don't care about and bet on it. It's like utter degeneracy. It's a lower order pleasure. And I think lower order pleasures in general are responsible for hedonism and hedonistic outlooks that do a ton of harm. I speak from experience. I told you before I used to be a hedonist. I told you I used to be a subjective hedonist. I even made it subjective, was my own like description of my own internal doctrine, so I could keep doing the stuff I wanted to do and justify it to myself. Well, my subjective code says that X is okay, and this is actually really scary because emotivism, the idea that what you feel is what is right and what is true, is now very apparent in our society, right? We have loads and loads of people in massive cultural movements telling us that because they feel a certain thing, that thing is necessarily now the case. And that is scary, especially when done in an authoritarian way. But it all stems from hedonism getting out of control. And in poker, hedonism is the bomb pot. Hedonism is the sports betting on the side just to get any little short-term rush. What are those people's outlooks like? How happy do they seem to you when they're sports betting? Miserable, utterly miserable. Because when you expend yourself in extreme bursts into micro moments of gambling or excitement or whatever, you leave nothing left long term. And this is probably a topic for another day. But if you have a healthy, balanced, unnihilistic poker approach where you maybe have a poker religion and you can see a poker afterlife for yourself, and you can see purpose and moral code, objective moral code for yourself within your current poker life, I think you'll be all right. Whereas if you succumb to hedonism and nihilism, and I think there's not a huge gulf between those two things, you might end up that zombie. And my old cliche is he's drinking a cup of tea and a pint at the same time, and he's betting on sports, and he goes, yeah, a cup of tea as well as a pint, mate, when the guy comes over to take his order. And that, to me, is a horrific destination. And I think in poker, it's clear to me that atheism leads to that. To some extent, let's go back to poker death here to wrap up. In life, it's less clear that you need to be a theist to avoid those things. That's much less clear. But yeah, this has been a really fascinating conversation, and I've never thought about poker death until today. And now that I have, I'm actually quite tempted to go away and think about when I stop doing my career, when I stop doing what I'm doing now, which is like obviously running a poker tuition business and stuff, what will I do, and how will what I do now relate to that? You've really got me thinking about that. So I really appreciate you bringing this topic up.
I'm glad to hear that. And I think this idea of nihilism in poker is so important, I think. And, I want to stress too, we've used an analogy to religion today, but like, I don't think that you have to be a quote unquote believer. But what you do have to believe in is, I think you have to believe in yourself. Like, you're worth more than nihilism. So I think every human being has an inherent dignity. And that what's sad sometimes about hedonism and boring, it's when people are better than that, and they shouldn't treat themselves like that. And you should hold yourself to a higher standard, and you should treat yourself well because you deserve it and because that's what you're meant to do. And I think that this idea of like God is dead, like this is like the Nietzschean, like, God is dead. We have no morals anymore because once we killed God, and I say we being like, this is what he wrote about. This was kind of like an overarching theme, is like, without a God, there'll be no, humans will have no direction. There'll be nothing for them to do. And it's going to be inherent on individuals to create their own value system. And I think in history, what this unfortunately led to is, in some ways, the horrors of communism, the horrors of Nazism, things like that. But, when we're left to create our own gods, it doesn't necessarily go well. But that doesn't mean it has to go badly. So I think that the kind of exciting thing about resisting nihilism is not what it doesn't allow you to do, but it's what all the things it allows you to do. And all the things it allows you to access. And, you have no idea what your potential is as a poker player. Like, you really don't. To squander that because it's easier to degen, to squander that because it's easier to, because poker is hard to learn, it's not worth it. Like, fine, that's your choice. And everyone's entitled to their own choice. And I certainly wouldn't criticize someone for that. I take a very libertarian approach to most things and how people live their life. And I think, as long as you're not hurting someone, I say good for you. But I do feel that doesn't keep me from acknowledging that it's sad when people destroy themselves, and it's sad when people squander their potential. To wrap this up, I think being aware of your own poker death, embracing it, and to the extent that you can, and allowing yourself to say, there is a poker afterlife, and I'm going to live as if there is a poker afterlife and not be a nihilist.
Absolutely. I think that's a wonderful summary from you, and this has been a truly interesting conversation. I'm excited to know what we'll be talking about next, because I haven't come up with it yet, but I'm going to do some thinking, and you guys can check out episode 4 in a week's time. Check us out on Spotify. Do rate the podcast if you've listened to an episode or two. It really helps. Smash the like button on YouTube, leave us a comment, and of course it's carrotcorner.com from everything else poker-wise by me. All right, Melissa, I'll see you in a week, and we will have another discussion on another philosophical, psychological, and weird and wonderful poker life topic. Until next time.
Okay, bye.
Bye, guys.